Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our Water Institute seminar. My name is Rob Delow, and I'm going to be your host and facilitator for the session. It is my really great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague Nigel Watson as our inaugural RBC Water Fellow at the University of Waterloo. Through its generous gift, RBC is supporting not only scholarships for the Collaborative Graduate Program, but also this fellowship series where we're planning to bring in experts and researchers and others to serve as fellows who can participate in the Collaborative Graduate Program and help us build connections with research groups around the world. And so Nigel is the very first. So Nigel is based at the Environment Centre in Lancaster University in the UK. His research focuses on water resources management and governance. He's very interested in what we call institutional arrangements and the development of collaborative initiatives at the local scale in catchments or watersheds, as we call them in North America. He's worked extensively with government departments and consultants in the UK on policies for catchment management. And his research program takes him around the world to Nigeria, the United States, Canada, and most recently Britain. In addition to his own research, he's contributed to a number of interdisciplinary research projects on water quality problems, catchment governance, and recovery after flood disasters. He's also the independent chair of the Ribble Life Catchment Management Partnership in the northwest of England, which is really important for somebody who studies these kinds of things because you have to be on the ground and on the factory floor to see how collaboration actually works. At Lancaster, he's director for 2 master's programs in environmental management, for some undergraduate programs in geography, and he serves as vice principal for one of the 8 student colleges that make up Lancaster University. Nigel will be based at the University of Waterloo in the Faculty of Environment in my home Department of Environment and Resource Studies until December 22nd when he heads back to the UK. So he's really looking forward to connecting with faculty, students, and staff who are interested in water management and governance around the world, but especially in the UK. And to give you a sense for the kind of work he does, he's going to share his thoughts on interdisciplinary water science and collaborative management using a case from his home country. So Nigel, welcome and thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob, for the really warm welcome and introduction, and thanks to you too for coming out this afternoon. It's a real privilege to be here to talk about interdisciplinarity and developments in collaborative water management. In the next hour, my aim is really twofold. First off, I just want to tell you the story about a project that I was involved in that experimented with interdisciplinary working and collaboration. The background to the project, what happened and its impacts and so forth. But perhaps more importantly, I'd like to reflect a little bit on the things we learned at Loweswater that might be helpful for future projects and also interdisciplinary water programs more generally. But before I do that, let's just spend a few minutes thinking about interdisciplinarity itself and also collaboration. It's often said that society shouldn't expect to be able to solve its water problems using the same thinking and approaches that helped to create those problems in the first place. And added to that, of course, it seems that most of our water problems, or an increasing number of our water problems, are complex or increasingly complex, intractable, and wicked. This certainly isn't a new idea, and Churchman was probably one of the first to write about it in the late 1960s. But it is an idea that's increasingly used to argue that research organised along disciplinary lines and also management approaches that are essentially top-down and hierarchical are simply not designed for the kind of conditions that we face today. And I think this is probably one of the main arguments for looking at alternatives, and particularly alternatives that emphasize interdisciplinary working and also collaborative approaches to problem solving. An added problem, of course, is that wicked problems have some other challenges associated with them. They are often inherently political, and that means that it's common to find, for example, inequalities in power and different levels of access to knowledge and information. That seems to be increasingly the norm when it comes to water resources problems. This suggests, I think, that the search for answers to these sorts of wicked water problems is as much about values and trade-offs, fairness and justice, as it is about scientific evidence and explanation. And this seems to imply that interdisciplinary and collaborative processes need to have the capability to engage with political matters rather than simply operate outside politics or at a distance from political processes. So if it's correct then that interdisciplinary thinking and action is increasingly needed, then what does that term mean? It's actually, in my experience at least, quite hard to find a clear operational definition. The US Academy of Sciences has made a useful start, as this example shows on the screen. Although useful, I think such a broad definition such as that one implies that just about any sort of interaction across disciplinary boundaries counts as interdisciplinary research. And that's useful, of course, but it doesn't really give us much insight into how to conduct interdisciplinary projects. Most researchers or writers on these sorts of matters seem to avoid the question of definition altogether and focus on mapping out the different forms of interdisciplinary research. Often the language appears to be contradictory and confusing, but one of the perhaps useful insights that can be found is the distinction that's often made between multi, inter, and transdisciplinary approaches. So I'm not going to go into great detail describing their particular characteristics, but essentially, it seems to me at least, that the main differences amongst these three versions or modes are that they differ in terms of the level of joint effort and sharing that takes place, the duration of the relationship, and thirdly, the degree to which the research practices actually change after the experience. Not everyone, it has to be said, sees it that way, though. And recently, Barry and Bourne, two commentators on interdisciplinary research, have argued that the real point is to generate new questions or forms of thought and experimental practices. They also point out that this kind of research isn't always about integration and synthesis, and that on occasion it's simply a matter of a tool or a technique or a concept being borrowed by one discipline from other disciplines. And also, in some cases, the relationship is antagonistic, where there are big differences of opinion and view in the disciplines that are involved in the project. So then, what do we mean by transdisciplinarity, and how does that square up against these other interpretations? Well, I think the striking feature of transdisciplinarity is that the interactions extend beyond members of the research communities. And as this quote illustrates, the point in transdisciplinary projects is that science works with decision makers in society rather than simply operating separately in isolation and at a distance, coming up with answers and solutions for society. So if that's some of the things that we think we know about interdisciplinary working, what's the situation when it comes to collaboration? Another idea that's increasingly popular when it comes to questions around water governance and management. Well, again, looking at two widely known and popular definitions from the literature, there's some obvious characteristics. In collaboration, it's often said that it's a richly joined arrangement where the different parties act together in response to a shared concern or problem. The parties not only integrate or share information and practical resources, but they combine or integrate their values and perspectives. So at this point, the thing that I'd like to emphasize is that it seems to me at least that interdisciplinarity and collaboration have some striking similarities, even though in the literature they're often discussed as entirely separate things. In work on collaboration, a great deal of attention, I think, has been given to trying to identify the success factors. And this example from Ansel and Gash is fairly typical of what you can find in the research literature, mapping out the different variables and conditions which seem to encourage success in collaborative efforts. But when you look across the entire research field, I think two particular factors stand out. First is the need for balanced power relationships amongst the participants, and secondly, a fair distribution of benefits and costs arising from the collaborative project. Without those two things, it seems to me that collaborative projects and initiatives are very unlikely to succeed in the long run. So, despite these similarities that exist between collaboration and interdisciplinarity, I think there are also some really important differences between the two. Interdisciplinarity seems to orientate itself more towards knowledge production, whereas collaboration seems to be more focused on knowledge sharing and knowledge application. Bearing that point in mind, I think that point helps to focus attention on a general research question. How might interdisciplinarity and collaboration be used together rather than separately by scientists, stakeholders, institutions and publics to create new forms of resource and environmental governance? This question formed the basis of a 3-year research project that I was part of in Loweswater in the northwest of England, which is what I'm going to talk about for most of the remainder of this session. So the project was funded by 3 research councils: social science, biological sciences and natural sciences, under a programme called RELU, which stands for Rural Economy and Land Use. So this idea then was the focus of our experiment. We believed that we could do some interesting and useful things with this question, but we weren't entirely sure how the project would pan out over the 3 years. So that's what I'd really like to focus on over the next half hour or so. Perhaps before I do that, and before somebody picks me up on it, I should probably say what I mean by governance, because obviously it's a widely used term and it can mean different things to different people. So in this presentation at least, when I'm talking about governance, I'm sort of using Oren Young's interpretation, which is essentially the full variety of social mechanisms that can be used for decision making and steering social groups towards desired outcomes. So when I say social, that includes political, institutional and cultural, all the different mechanisms that are potentially available for making those sorts of important decisions and following up with appropriate action. So our project then was based at Loweswater in the English Lake District. This is a small lake, but also a village that goes by the same name, inside the Lake District National Park. Loweswater, as hopefully you can see from the map, is part of a much more complex lake system that eventually drains out into the Irish Sea. The catchment that surrounds the lake is only 8 square kilometres. Half of the catchment is owned by an organisation called the National Trust, which essentially acquires properties and sites of cultural and environmental importance and manages them in the public interest. So the National Trust owns half of the catchment and it also owns the lake. The other half of the catchment is farmed by 7 farmers who essentially are engaged in sheep farming and some cattle production. The landscape is a typical sort of mix from the English Lake District, high fells, rough grazing, and some improved pasture. The area is also, as you might expect, incredibly popular with tourists. The Lake District is probably the big honeypot site of all in the whole of the UK. It attracts millions of people during the summer months. So in the early 2000s at Loweswater, some of the local residents began to notice problems with blue-green algae, big blooms around the lake. And this prompted the National Trust to post warning signs for dog owners, people who might be tempted to swim in the lake, and generally anybody who might come into contact with the water. This obviously caused a lot of local concern and seemed to unsettle relationships in the local community. Very strong and very different views emerged in the community and in some of the organisations associated with the community regarding what was going on, what the explanation might be, and who might be responsible for this problem. And in particular, some of the farmers felt that they were being largely blamed for this entire problem because it does appear that it is a problem related to phosphorus enrichment. But again, there's lots of uncertainty about where that problem is actually originating from. So the farmers themselves began to discuss this issue and to try and figure out what the explanation might be in the early 2000s, and this led to some relationships forming with researchers from Lancaster University and also the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which is a government research institute which is based on the Lancaster campus. And so that relationship gradually matured, and eventually that led to this 3-year research project that was aimed at understanding or improving understanding of this problem, but also, most importantly, trying to come up with some positive actions to address this issue at Loweswater. So that was the basis for the project then, but it wasn't just about algae, and that's probably the key thing to try and remember about the whole project. We wanted to conduct interdisciplinary research to try and understand that problem, but in the context of wider connections and relationships that might be taking place within the catchment or affecting the catchment at a larger spatial scale. So it was about algae and water quality, but it was also about land use, about farm livelihoods, historical change that might have happened in this landscape, the social composition of the communities and the village itself and how that had changed, and also links to policy frameworks, links to European agricultural policy, for example, and links to European water policy, such as the Water Framework Directive. So it was about algae, but we wanted it, or we thought we could investigate the problem in a wider context through interdisciplinary research. We also wanted to be really ambitious. We wanted the research to be relevant and useful to the local community. Hopefully it would help them and some of the agencies and institutions involved to be confident about taking action in the future, involve relevant organisations and groups, stakeholders, but also to try and influence widely by engaging with policy groups at higher levels, policy groups for catchment management, water planning, and agricultural policy that were making important decisions at a national level, as well as groups that are making decisions at a local level. So this is what we were striving for in this 3-year project. So simply what I'm going to do next is describe for you some of the characteristics of the project that we put in place and their distinctive qualities. So one of the first things that happened was that we put together a balanced, I think it's fair to say, but very eclectic team of people. So we had ecologists, terrestrial and aquatic ecologists, myself looking at catchment management, but a cultural geographer, a sociologist, and three other very important people. Ken Bell is a chap who is actually one of the local farmers at Loweswater. And we recruited him actually onto the research team because it was very clear to us that he had a lot of local knowledge, he knew a lot about past farming practices, but he was very well connected in the community, and he was going to be our boundary spanner, in effect, somebody who could work behind the scenes and make this project really come together, even though we were at least initially working at some distance from the site. We also had a farm advisor who knew the area very well, and a couple of people who'd worked on fish ecology at Loweswater for an extensive period of time. So we put together quite a distinctive team, I think. That was one of the key elements of our approach. The second element was that we created a knowledge collective as a sort of institutional mechanism that would foster and steer focused research and interdisciplinary research that would really involve the local community in a meaningful way and would actually steer that community and land managers towards a more positive and more successful future. So the knowledge collective idea is one that appears a lot in the research literature, but the label knowledge collective wasn't very popular with the community. It seemed a bit radical, if I'm honest. So very quickly, after a couple of months in this project, the collective adopted a new name, the Loweswater Care Project, and the group created its own vision statement, as you can see at the bottom of this slide. So this vision statement wasn't something that we, as a research team, created for this project. One of the early events that we held was about visioning, and this statement came out of that discussion that involved the local community and some of the agencies and organisations as well. So the Loweswater Care Project was conceived as a knowledge collective, or simply a forum, where science would work with politics rather than seek to replace politics. The deliberate attempt not to sort of privilege science in any way in this process, and to recognise that there are a lot of value judgments and subjectivities around what was going on in the catchment, and that needed to be retained, not something that was going to be replaced simply by scientists coming in and presenting supposedly factual knowledge. So to help this along, the LCP, the Loweswater Care Project, adopted 4 very important principles to guide the discussions throughout the 3-year project. So all forms of knowledge and expertise are valued but need to be debated. Nothing should be taken for granted, regardless of who is making those statements. Uncertainties need to be highlighted and acknowledged. Uncovering and making connections is a valuable thing to do. Looking at links between the local economy and farming practices and water quality was something that we believed would be useful, rather than just zooming in on the specific water quality problem in a narrow sense. And fourthly, doubt and questioning needs to be extended to all claims, including scientific representations and explanations. So all the work that we were doing as scientists and ecologists, we recognised shouldn't be just presented as undisputed facts. We actually wanted those pieces of information to be scrutinised and debated in this Loweswater Care Project forum. So how did we actually do this or attempt to do this? Well, the next few slides are sort of snapshots from different meetings that we held at Loweswater. So I should say that before I go any further, there were around 15 meetings held over a 3-year period in Loweswater. They were always held at the local village hall in the evenings. Each meeting lasted for 3 or 4 hours, and these were quite social occasions, as well as important opportunities to engage in discussion and deliberation over some of the scientific work that was being conducted. So valuing knowledge was one of our guiding principles. And these photographs were taken at one of the early meetings where we invited members of the community and representatives for the different agencies to bring along documents, artifacts, anything that they believed might be interesting and valuable that might shed some sort of light on the past of this catchment system. So it was a bit like Antiques Roadshow. I don't know if you watched that show, but that's this kind of feel to it. People were bringing along pieces of information that they they'd perhaps had in their attic for decades that they'd never even thought about for a long time, but actually turned out to be incredibly useful. Records of past fishing catches, details of farms that used to be in operation, even pieces of farming equipment that said something about the kinds of practices that had gone on in the past, were all brought together in this single meeting, and it acted as a way of generating discussion and sparking off new thoughts and ideas about how this catchment had evolved in the long term. Another important idea that we wanted to put into practice was that all knowledge and expertise needed to be a focus of debate rather than something simply taken for granted. So in many respects, we promoted the idea that expertise is a collective quality rather than an individual quality. You can almost think of it as expertness of a group rather than expertise of an individual. This was an idea that we really wanted to emphasize throughout the 15 meetings that were held at Loweswater. And to achieve this, of course, this requires very careful and very respectful facilitation, to give people the opportunity to challenge other people's ideas and to engage in constructive deliberation. So this was another of the notions that we tried to put into practice at Loweswater. As I said earlier, one of the ideas in this project was that it's really important to try and make connections and not just zoom in too narrowly on a specific problem. Now, if I'm totally honest, and I will be, a lot of the monitoring and the modelling was done by our ecologists. But the difference was that their data collection strategies, their models, and their results were openly shared at the LCP meetings. So even people who had no prior experience or knowledge of modelling could ask whatever they wanted to ask about the work that had been done. And one of the really interesting things and valuable things that came out of this piece of work was that it took some of the pressure off the farmers. Up until this point, a lot of people essentially believed that the whole problem was down to farming. But what the modelling showed was that actually phosphorus levels in the soils around the lake were not particularly high. And there was a big sigh of relief amongst the farming community when that piece of evidence came out. But it did show actually that other sources of nutrients, such as animal waste and also septic tanks, waste tanks from some of the rural properties that were not connected to any sort of main system, that turned out to be significant. So the modelling actually opened up the whole question and helped to show that whilst farming might be part of the problem, it wasn't the complete explanation. Before I go ahead, I don't know if you can see it particularly clearly, but the photograph just close to me shows the monitoring buoy that was put on the lake to gather data throughout the project. We had to paint it grey. Initially, it was bright yellow, but as part of the discussions at the LCP, that was seen as rather alarming. It seemed to suggest that there was a crisis on the lake, and that wouldn't be good enough. So the monitoring buoy was painted grey so that it would kind of fade into the background, and people were very happy with that. But we still managed to get the data, which was the most important thing of all. So another idea that we held on to, or tried to hold on to, was that all sorts of claims, whether they were scientific or policy related, should be questioned, openly questioned, and where necessary, challenged. And one way we did this was to hold a meeting, an LCP meeting, with the title of Getting to Know Your Institutions. So up until this point, a lot of the agencies and other bodies had been vaguely interested in what was going on at Loweswater, but had kept their distance. So this was an opportunity to invite them in, and literally they attended a meeting and they were given an opportunity to describe their organisation, what they were about, what their mandate and objectives involved, and for people to ask lots of questions. So for them, for the agencies, this was a very new and very different way of doing things, to actually be at a very local level, not operating at a distance, and also having to justify their policies and explain what they were doing in a very public fashion. So the National Trust, the Environment Agency, which is one of the key bodies responsible for environmental protection and water planning in England, was there. The Lake District National Park, and also Natural England, another important organisation that delivers a lot of agri-environmental policies that provide financial incentives for farmers to change some of the things that they do. So these organisations came to this meeting, and on one level you might think that's not particularly remarkable, but in the context of what had happened before, this was a major step forward. Another thing that we were very conscious of at the start of this project was that we didn't really know where it was going to end up. So we were very committed to this participatory style of working, but combining some good quality research as part of that process. But we didn't know where that would lead us and what other work might need to be done. So we were very lucky with the research grant that we were awarded, because it allowed us to set aside £35,000, round about $70,000, unallocated in reserve for some point in the future when we might, we being the LCP, might decide that some extra work would need to be done. And what is more, and this is where the principle of balance comes back into play, we wanted to give other people as much opportunity as the researchers to do some of the extra work. So here we've got some of the small projects that were funded out of that extra pot of research money. So one local resident who happened to be a retired chemist did an interesting piece of work on household detergents and septic tank operation around the community. Other people looked at historical records of land use and nutrients, extra modelling work looking at how phosphates were travelling from soil into watercourses, and a piece of work on tourism, and also looking at how sediment and nutrients were flowing through the lake system as a whole. So in exactly the same way as the major pieces of work were openly discussed and debated in the LCP, these small pieces of work were approved by the LCP, and the findings that came out of these pieces of work were reported back at a subsequent meeting. So for me, as somebody who's interested in governance matters, one of the really interesting things that came out during this study was that we uncovered some fascinating and complex cross-scale institutional misfits. So it's the institutions that are misfits, not Rob Delow, sorry. So during the project, we encountered lots of instances where thinking and behaving at a catchment or watershed scale just didn't fit with what other agencies and organisations were trying to do. And this, in some respects, became just a simple matter of not being able to apply for funding because the Loweswater catchment was outside a particularly designated zone or was of the wrong scale. But there were some other extreme examples as well. So this is a quote that comes from a government inquiry, a House of Lords inquiry into the implementation of the European Union Water Framework Directive. And one of the people who was asked to give evidence in that inquiry was the then Chief Executive of the Environment Agency. And she went on record by saying, essentially, that she totally disagreed with participatory approaches. You know, she used phrases like, I want action, I don't want discussion, I want doing, I want outcome, I want river basins to get better. So this was the Chief Executive of the Environment Agency going on public record, essentially saying, my agency can do this without anybody else, thank you very much, which was essentially a directly opposite to the things we were trying to do at Loweswater. So on the one hand, the Environment Agency was one of our key stakeholders, and some of the local staff were very interested and supportive in what we were doing, but nevertheless they belonged to an agency that fundamentally disagreed, or at least at the time, appeared to fundamentally disagree with the kind of style of working that we were trying to experiment with. So we carried on this process for 3 years. People seemed to enjoy it. People came back to the meetings time and time again. But so what? What sort of impact or difference does this kind of approach to catchment management and research really make? Well, not surprisingly, the algae problem hasn't gone away. It crops up regularly at different times of the year without any clear explanation. But what we have achieved, I think, is that this issue is something that is now questioned and debated in a more open fashion. And there's a recognition that it's part of a wider issue or problem involving rural land use, which is connected to rural livelihoods and also connected to policies, some of which are actually made in Brussels by the European Union, but have a direct effect on farm subsidies and the viability of some of the 7 farms in this catchment. So it's a much bigger, more complex situation than we initially might have thought it was. The project, and certainly the problem, has become a source of action and social capital. Some of the farmers have changed their business plans. They've reduced some of the nutrient inputs. They've taken some of the cattle out of the catchment and moved them elsewhere, where there's evidence that that was causing a problem. And talking to the local residents, many of them say that one of the best things about the project is that it's enhanced social capital in the community, where there was sort of feelings of mistrust and blame previously, particularly between the National Trust and the farmers, who were literally on opposite sides of the lake. That relationship has improved enormously, and they've combined efforts in many examples and conducted practical work cleaning out some of the channels that feed into the lake and also some of the channels that feed out of the lake into the rest of the system. So it seemed to have had a positive effect on the ground. Even though the funding for the project came to an end, the LCP has continued to meet, although in a slightly different form, and some of the local people are carrying on with their own investigations following the model that the LCP started a few years back. And I think, just to emphasise again, the researchers who were involved in the project and some of the other participants would say that this algal problem is now seen as something that is connected to wider issues of rural development, rural depopulation, issues of farm viability, agricultural policy, farm subsidies. These are all parts of the puzzle which ordinarily probably wouldn't have been considered in a traditional kind of investigation. Looking further afield, outside the catchment itself, the LCP has been pretty influential in changing catchment management policy regionally and nationally. It's not the only factor, of course. There are other reasons why government policy has changed, but Westminster policymakers in London have taken note of what has happened at Loweswater and are now emphasising much more local, collaborative ways of water planning, where agencies are involved, but they are not necessarily the primary organisations in charge. So it might have been fortunate that the project came along at a time when policymakers were already starting to think about changing the way they were doing things, but the LCP provided a useful model that policymakers seem to like and have encouraged other communities to adopt throughout the country. So, to finish off then, what can we take from this project that might be helpful in the future for other groups that might be interested in this combined, collaborative, interdisciplinary approach, and for wider initiatives that emphasise problem solving around water? Well, I've just got a few sort of highlights from the project that I'd like to share with you, which might be helpful. Well, I think it's important in these kinds of activities to look for favourable conditions. At Loweswater, we were very fortunate. The algal problem was a very salient issue. It was visible. The public was very interested in it already. And the agencies and institutions were very accepting of our presence. We weren't in a situation where the agencies were already on the case and that a group of researchers from a university were arriving on the scene and trying to muscle in on their territory. Actually, the situation was that the agencies were very standoffish and weren't quite sure how to go about tackling this problem, and that created an opportunity for our research group to offer to help. So we had some very favourable conditions at Loweswater, and it does beg the question, is this a unique example? Would it be possible somewhere else or not? Another thing I think that emerged from this project is that it's important not to get too hooked on labels. What I mean by that is that within the context of a single project, there were elements that were multidisciplinary, elements that were interdisciplinary, parts which might be imagined as being transdisciplinary, but equally there was disciplinary research as well, all in the same project, all going on simultaneously. So I think that might be useful and valuable, not to get too hooked up and preoccupied with trying to define what it is that we're doing and give it a label. Sometimes it's about doing what the project calls for rather than emphasising transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity. Another thing that we consciously did was to engage with community level institutions and politics not to try and depoliticise the process. So, in many respects, local politics, in this case, became a positive force rather than something that was a threat to what we were trying to do. So, having a vision statement that was produced by the group itself, having some good quality facilitation, sharing the research funding, having somebody who could work behind the scenes as a boundary spanner, all of those things helped to keep the politics live at the same time as the science was going on, rather than pushing the politics out of the room so that science dominated the proceedings. Another thing I think that we learnt at Loweswater is that it's really important to keep sight of the immediate problem and not to push too hard for making things seemingly more complex and insisting on wider connections. As academics, of course, people get very excited about reframing problems, making things more and more complex, and so forth. But for many people, that's not the point. For some of our participants, the point was that they didn't like the algal blooms on their lake. And if we'd lost sight of that, I think the whole process would have been compromised. So for us, keeping the right balance between opening up the discussion and the inquiry and focusing the inquiry and the discussion on the specific problem was actually crucial. Had we gone too far, one way or the other, I think that the process would have been compromised. Last points I'd like to make. I think it's really important to recognise that this sort of knowledge making is really quite new and for some people very unsettling. The idea that science isn't going to arrive on the scene and provide unequivocal answers and absolute truths is new for some people. So in this experience, where scientists were openly admitting that they couldn't provide those answers and that they were faced with lots of uncertainty was new and challenging. So we actually had to spend a lot of time in getting over that hurdle and showing people that in many respects the scientists were just as ignorant about what was going on as everybody else, or maybe even more ignorant in some respects about what was going on in the catchment. So don't expect everybody to get it immediately when this kind of style of investigation and project is undertaken. You can't do these things from a cold start. You've really got to commit to the place and the people. The project started in 2007, but from 2003, 2004 onwards, researchers have been in contact with the community, having discussions, building up relationships. So actually, there was as much time, if not more time, spent pre-project phase as actually delivering the project itself. And that's really important. In my view, you can't just expect to arrive into a rural catchment and be openly welcomed in terms of what you want to do. The last thing I'd like to emphasize is that I think it's really important to maintain a sort of healthy skepticism about these sorts of processes. It's easy to talk up community-based projects where people are sharing information, where they're getting involved in science and having open discussions and debates. But is that really new water governance? Are they really making a significant difference to what is going on? Or are the agencies and institutions essentially carrying on as normal, but in the background, while some of these local processes are added into the mix, as it were? So I think this is really fertile ground for future investigation. I think there are questions about whether the Loweswater approach can be transferred to other settings, other catchments, other watersheds, or other biophysical regions. But there are also important questions about whether this style of research and investigation could be applied in different scales or across different spatial scales. So could you do the same thing, for example, when you were investigating the relationship between energy production and water, or forestry and water, rather than just something that is essentially heavily water focused? So I hope that's given you a bit of an insight into what the project attempted to do. There's going to be a paper coming out very shortly in PLOS Biology that describes the project in a lot more depth and detail than I've been able to do this afternoon. But if any of you are interested in developing these kind of ideas in future projects, I'd be really pleased to talk to you over the next few weeks. I'm going to be here for a while, up until December 22nd, and as Rob said at the beginning, I'm based in ERS, Environmental Resource Studies, in room 2039, and I'd love to talk to some of you. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you very much, Nigel. So a reminder, we are live streaming this event, so I'm very looking forward to taking some questions from people, but for the purposes of the live streaming, what I may be doing is repeating your questions so that folks are watching remotely can hear. So that left me with lots of questions, but I'm going to hold my tongue because I want to see if folks on the floor have some thoughts or questions or comments that they'd like to suggest. And if we don't get rolling right away, I'll dig right in. But I saw a hand spasming up there right away. So, Mark, please, go ahead.
How are you doing, Nigel? I was wondering, you had a kind of a crisis. You got toxic algae in this watershed, and that kind of brought the people to the table. In most of our watershed issues, we've got these gradual degradations and no big crisis until it's too late. Can we use this kind of a model, or what was the role of the crisis of toxic algae? If it was just eutrophication, would it matter, or is it toxicity?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Having a crisis at Loweswater was fortunate for us in that it focused attention. It was something that immediately brought the issues into the public eye. And there's lots of kind of documented research around watershed and catchment management where initiatives have essentially failed because there wasn't an issue. Even though the policymakers were desperately keen to have a catchment plan or engage in some way, there wasn't something to engage in. So I suppose the issue becomes is can you construct a crisis in a sense that would interest people, even if it's not already out there in the public domain? Is there a way of taking a piece of scientific work that is shedding light on something that may not be particularly well known about, but could be very significant in the future, and putting that out there and hoping or encouraging people to engage in that? So it's not a full-blown crisis, but it could be a topic of interest. But my hunch is that without finding that entry point, whether it's water quantity or water quality or rural livelihoods, without having something to anchor onto, these sorts of projects are going to be very difficult to get off the ground.
Okay, so we have a question over here. I'm just wondering, you mentioned scale, and we have a crisis in Western Lake Erie. Can you imagine this process being scaled up to a watershed with different governments, different cities, people who live thousands or hundreds of kilometers apart being so involved?
I think I could imagine it, but I think it would probably be some sort of nested arrangement. I think the thing about the Loweswater project, it had a strong sense of place, and we were very fortunate that, in effect, the lake and the village are the same entity, and people connected with that. Whereas when you go up to much bigger systems, of course, people don't connect with the system in the same way. So I can imagine this sort of thing working, but it might be a nested arrangement where very small sub-watersheds are part of bigger groups, which are part of even bigger groups. So it'd be a really interesting experiment to try. But my hunch would be to have some big group from different communities and different agencies all sat around the same table at the same time would be difficult, because you wouldn't have that sort of close interaction that you get when you are working at a very local scale.
I was just curious, when you mentioned the meeting where all these different artifacts were brought together, different pieces of information, and I was wondering if it was always sort of clearly defined from the outset who would take the lead in kind of synthesizing that. You had mentioned the ecologists
Yeah.
taking the lead in the modeling process, but was that the main output, or were there other outputs, and was that ever contested?
No, it was very open-ended in a sense of, I suppose it could have gone wrong. You know, people might not have attended that meeting. They might have brought things along that were really boring. Fortunately, they seem to come up. They seem to get the idea that because they or their families have got a history with the site, they might have some insights to share. So, in a sense, what happened was that people would stand by the table where they had put their own artifacts, and people would come around the room, and it would start a conversation about that particular piece of information. And then at the end of the evening, it was sort of all brought together, and particular pieces of information that stood out, that generated a lot of interest and discussion, were sort of discussed again in front of the whole group. But it wasn't a sort of discrete piece of work where it was written up as a report and said, well, you know, look at what this shows. In many ways, it was part of the social process of getting the LCP going, as much as the substantive content of the artifacts and the documents themselves. And it was a way of basically saying to people, hey, actually, you have got some really useful information at your fingertips, even though you might not have thought about it that way in the past.
Nigel, at the risk of sounding like a compatriot of the Commissioner, I'm just wondering, you didn't comment much on actions that resulted from the process. So I guess my question is, does anything change on the ground? Can a process be successful without positive, tangible outcomes on the ground?
Yeah.
In this case, with regards to the algal problem in the lake.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's a really important question, because, you know, you can have a fantastically, I'm not saying it was a fantastically successful process, but you could have a successful process that meets all the criteria of a successful process that nevertheless doesn't have any external or wider impact on the ground itself. Locally, it definitely has had some tangible impacts. So going back to my point about institutional misfits, early on in the project, the Loweswater group was really disappointed because the UK government launched a catchment restoration fund, which had millions of pounds available for exactly the sorts of things that they needed to do. But Loweswater wasn't in one of the priority geographical areas where the money was available. By the time the project came to an end, Loweswater, magically enough, was in a priority area. How you explain that? You know, was it the Loweswater group and the fact that they were becoming known and very vocal influenced policymakers so that they effectively redrew their funding map? Or was that something that would have happened anyway? Is really hard to know. But on a very, very hard-nosed practical level, you know, the farmers have changed a lot of what they were doing. And just as an anecdote, an interesting anecdote, when the project came to an end, the LCP applied for government funding and they got £500,000, $1 million for practical work on the ground in this tiny little catchment. So they are doing things like soil aeration, they've bought new equipment and things like that. But what's really interesting is that the LCP, as an organisation, as a group, felt that they weren't accountable enough to be able to handle that kind of money. So the LCP has had to actually join forces with another organisation that operates at a much bigger geographical scale, that has sort of the kind of accounting, transparency, credentials to handle a big budget. So, you know, in a way, kind of the success became a problem for the LCP. It got lots of money to do the things that it wanted to do, but then it couldn't handle the situation.
I've just got a point or question about your last one of your points again about complexity and not making it too complex. So you mentioned that, and I totally understand in terms of working with very local stakeholders to not be too overwhelming with complexity. But you also mentioned the cross-scale issues and the fact that something happening at the EU level might be filtering down.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you manage that. How do you deal with that? How do you decide what's important and what's not? Is it a case of you keep certain things in your own brain as a researcher, but you only present some things to others, or how do you deal with that?
When you say how you manage it, you mean in the context of the project?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're talking about cross-scale influences
Yeah.
of something happening at a local
Yeah.
level, plus what's happening at the local level is extremely complex. As
Yeah.
you've demonstrated, there's only 7 farmers, but it's taken 3 years to sort of get to where things are now. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff happening outside.
Yeah.
So how do you manage that complexity in a way that is still not overwhelming for others?
I guess over the 3-year period and the 15 meetings, we were gradually and carefully expanding that immediate problem out. But we're doing it in a very sort of tangible way. So some of the farmers would tell us that at certain times of the year, they were bringing in cattle into the catchment from other areas. And so we said, so why is that happening? Yeah, why is that necessary for your farm business? You know, are you getting subsidies to do that? So you sort of expand the problem out, but in a very concrete way, as opposed to a very abstract way where we're just talking about complex systems, which people find it very difficult to relate to. So to do it in a very sort of tangible, real life fashion, I think people can relate to that. Whereas you talk about cross-scale, complex systems, that's a harder thing to get across.
Nigel, one of the points you made was that it's very important to commit to the place and the people. And you talked about the front end, how the commitment began in advance of the project and you built relationships. But you left, right? Like the project ended and the researchers left, right? So how was that viewed by the people to whom you were committing? Because that's often going to be the character of this kind of work. You know, most people who do this kind of research are not going to be in a position to devote themselves to this little catchment and those 7 farmers for the rest of their careers. They're going to come, they're going to do the work, they're going to leave. Are those things incompatible, or were the folks you were working with, did they take that in stride and realize that that was going to happen and that it was okay?
I think we were totally honest from the outset, and you know, we said we had funding for 3 years, and that the funding was for research, and that whilst we might identify solutions, actions that could be taken at Loweswater as a research project, we weren't in a position to pay for that or to make that happen. And so it was very clear from the outset that this was a time-limited arrangement, and that everything might stop at the end if people found it unsatisfactory or you know, there wasn't a way forward. But there was a hope that we could start something that other people would want to carry on with. And in a sort of way that has happened. But we were very open and honest and explicit at the start that we wouldn't be there for the next 20 years, in an official capacity at least. And I think in many respects, and some of my colleagues on the project might disagree with me, but in many ways, a sign of success for us was that we were able to leave. That sufficient development, local development had happened, and that there was a group that was self-organizing and self-managing itself, so that they weren't dependent on these external researchers anymore, and that it was, in a sense, it was a time for us to leave and for the group to sort of go off in its own way and do its own thing, as the transition from research to action was also occurring. It seemed to be a good point for the researchers to take a back seat. Having said that, the researchers do regularly go to the meetings that carry on even now, but in a more interested capacity rather than somebody who's actually there to organise the thing.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions.
May follow on from Rob's question a little bit, but in this case, we're a group of academics who are doing research on the process and guided the process very carefully from an academic perspective. But in terms of water management, do you feel the process can be administered by public agencies, or how to proceed in the absence of a group of academics?
Well, yeah. Well, perhaps I can answer that in terms of telling you what has actually happened at Loweswater. So the LCP has signed up with a not-for-profit Rivers Trust that manages or has responsibility for a much larger geographical area that includes several watersheds. And that Rivers Trust has been appointed by government to deliver catchment management in that local area. So it's sort of become slightly more official, slightly less community focused, but more policy orientated as government has woken up to this way of doing business. But my hunch is that some of the really nice qualities that existed in the LCP project at the beginning are not so important now that it's operated by a Rivers Trust, which is essentially being funded by national government to do practical things on the ground that don't necessarily always need research or don't necessarily always call for open debate and discussion. So it's sort of evolved on and become a slightly different beast as a result of policy changes and funding, and the fact that we are no longer actively involved on the ground, asking these questions, opening out processes, emphasising complexity, all those sorts of things. Those aspects are perhaps not so important as they were during the project itself.
So technically, we're over time here, but people are still here. I'm happy we have the space for a little bit longer. If anybody urgently needs to leave, we don't want to hold you, but if you'd like to stay, and Nigel, if you're okay, we can maybe take a few more questions.
Sure.
So, are there any more thoughts from the audience? Or did I just kill my comment? Yeah, please.
Oh, if we could just enlighten on the science a little bit, just for the watershed. What's the sense of like how deep that lake was? What was the geology? We got the algae bloom problem, but it's on a very small scale. So I wonder how much turnover in the lake there was, that kind of thing, from a science perspective.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Pretty much out of my depth to answer it, if I'm totally honest. If the ecologist was here with me, he'd be able to give you a really good answer to that. But it is something that's discussed in this paper that's coming out in PLOS Biology, hopefully very shortly. Yeah.
Okay, so I will
I think it is. I suppose the counter-argument is that what would the money go into? So, given the uncertainty around the algae problem, if it was obvious that it was down to farmer X or farmer Y, then you might argue, yeah, just take a whole bunch of money and apply it to that farm and fix the problem. I mean, the other dimension, of course, is that all of this land is essentially privately owned. Even the National Trust, in a sense, whilst it acts in the public good, is effectively a private organisation. So even the agency, the Environment Agency, isn't in a position to go in there and tell private landowners what to do. So doing it this way, doing it the way we did it, where farmers hopefully make their own decisions and come round to a particular conclusion, seems to be the only way of doing it, because regulation just doesn't fit in a situation where you haven't got tangible evidence. If we were talking about pollution that was coming out of pipes, you could probably say, yeah, let's just regulate and fix the problem, but it doesn't seem to be that kind of situation. And because of the uncertainty, this sort of social way of tackling problems, as opposed to letting a single agency dive in at the deep end and apply rules and regulations, seems to be the better way, the only way of doing it, I think.